The sun was setting over the quiet suburban neighborhood as 82-year-old Helen Johnson sat in her favorite armchair, gazing wistfully out the window. The once vibrant colors of the garden she had tended for decades were fading into dusk, much like the vitality that had defined her own life in years past. Helen's eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the side table, a smiling portrait of her and her beloved husband, Robert, taken on their 40th wedding anniversary. It had been 5 years since Robert's passing, and the house now felt emptier than ever. Thankfully, Helen was not alone. Her son, Michael, had moved in to care for her after the loss of his father. Though the transition had been difficult, Michael's unwavering devotion and gentle presence had been a comfort in Helen's darkest moments. As Helen's health began to decline, however, Michael realized he could no longer provide all the care she needed on his own. Reluctantly, he made the decision to hire a home health aide to assist with tasks like bathing, dressing, and medication management. After interviewing several candidates, Michael settled on Sarah, a kind-faced woman in her 30s with several years of experience tending to elderly clients. Sarah seemed warm and capable, and Helen had initially warmed to her as well. In the early weeks, the arrangement worked well. Sarah would arrive each morning, greeting Helen with a cheerful smile and helping her through the day's routines. Michael was relieved to see his mother adjusting to the change, and he gradually felt comfortable leaving Helen in Sarah's care while he went to work. But as the months passed, Helen's attitude toward the home health aide began to shift. She would become increasingly agitated and withdrawn whenever Sarah arrived, often begging Michael not to leave her alone with the woman. Michael initially attributed this to his mother's natural resistance to change, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that crept up within him. "I don't want her here, Michael," Helen would plead, her eyes filled with a fear that her son had rarely seen. "Please, don't make me be with her." Michael would gently reassure his mother, reminding her that Sarah was there to help and that he would only be gone for a few hours. He would then depart for work, hoping that the day would pass without incident. However, as the weeks turned into months, Michael found himself becoming more and more concerned about his mother's behavior. Helen's distress seemed to worsen with each of Sarah's visits, and she would often be visibly shaken and withdrawn when Michael returned home. One afternoon, as Michael prepared to leave for his part-time job at the local hardware store, he noticed Helen's hands trembling as she clutched the arm of her chair. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, kneeling down to meet her gaze. Helen's eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen, where Sarah was tidying up after their lunch. "I don't want her here, Michael," Helen whispered, her voice quivering. "Please, you have to make her leave." Michael felt a twinge of alarm at the desperation in his mother's voice. Gently, he placed his hand over hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I know you're uneasy with Sarah here, but she's here to help, remember?" he said, keeping his tone calm and soothing. "I'll only be gone for a few hours, and then I'll be back. Everything will be just fine." Helen shook her head, her grip tightening on Michael's hand. "No, you don't understand," she insisted, her eyes pleading. She's not right, Michael. I can't be alone with her." Michael's brow furrowed with concern. He had never seen his mother this distraught, and the fear in her voice was palpable. Glancing up, he noticed Sarah watching them from the kitchen, her expression unreadable. "All right, Mom," Michael said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll stay home today. I'm sure the hardware store can manage without me for one afternoon." Helen's shoulders visibly relaxed, and some of the tension left her face. Michael offered her a reassuring smile, but deep down, he was beginning to wonder if there was more to his mother's distress than he had initially realized. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the living room in a warm, golden glow, Michael knew that he would need to get to the bottom of this. His mother's well-being was the top priority, and if something was truly amiss, he would do whatever it took to protect her. Over the next several weeks, Michael's unease only grew as he witnessed his mother's increasing distress whenever Sarah arrived for her daily visits. Helen would become visibly agitated, her hands trembling and her eyes darting nervously around the room. Despite Michael's reassurances, she would beg him not to leave her alone with the home health aide. At first, Michael tried to rationalize his mother's behavior. Perhaps it was simply a matter of adjusting to the presence of a stranger in their home, or maybe Helen was feeling overwhelmed by the changes to her routine. Michael knew that growing older could be a difficult and confusing process, and he didn't want to dismiss his mother's concerns. However, as time passed, Helen's fear and aversion to Sarah only seemed to intensify. Michael began to notice small details that only fueled his growing sense of alarm. The way Sarah would sometimes linger a little too long in Helen's room, or the occasional sharp tone in her voice when speaking to his mother. One afternoon, as Michael was preparing to leave for work, he found Helen huddled in the corner of her bedroom, her thin frame trembling. Rushing to her side, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his heart sinking at the look of pure terror in her eyes. "Mom, what happened?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Helen's gaze darted toward the doorway, and she gripped Michael's arm with surprising strength. She was rough with me," Helen whispered, her voice barely audible, "and she said such awful things." Michael felt a surge of protectiveness and anger wash over him. Carefully, he helped his mother to her feet and guided her to the living room, settling her into the familiar comfort of her favorite armchair. "What did she do, Mom?" he asked, kneeling beside her and taking her hands in his. "What did Sarah say?" Helen's eyes were downcast, her lips trembling as she struggled to find the words. She grabbed my arm so tightly, and she told me that I was a burden," Helen said, her voice wavering. "She said that no one cared about me, that I was just a waste of her time." Michael felt his blood run cold. Reaching out, he gently tilted his mother's chin, his eyes searching her face for any signs of injury. To his dismay, he noticed several faint bruises peeking out from beneath the sleeve of her blouse. "Mom, did she hurt you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm so sorry, Michael," she said, her voice laced with shame. "I should have said something sooner, but I was so afraid." Michael felt a surge of protectiveness and anger wash over him. Carefully, he helped his mother to her feet and guided her to the living room, settling her into the familiar comfort of her favorite armchair. "You got nothing to be sorry for, Mom," he said, his voice firm but laced with concern. "I'm the one who should have listened to you. I should have seen the signs." Helen reached out and squeezed Michael's hand, her own fingers trembling. "I know you were just trying to help me," she said, her gaze meeting his. "But I can't. I can't be alone with her. I'm so afraid of what she might do." Michael's jaw tightened, his mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. He had trusted Sarah, had believed her to be a caring and competent professional. But now, in the face of his mother's distress and the evidence of physical abuse, he could no longer ignore the growing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. Gently, he pulled Helen into a comforting embrace, his heart aching at the thought of his once vibrant mother living in such fear. "Don't worry, Mom," he murmured, his voice soothing. "I won't leave you alone with her again. I promise." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the living room in a warm, golden glow, Michael knew that he would need to take decisive action. His mother's well-being was the top priority, and if Sarah had indeed betrayed their trust, he would do whatever it took to protect Helen and hold the home health aide accountable. The following day, Michael arrived home earlier than usual, determined to get to the bottom of his mother's distress. As he entered the house, he was struck by the eerie silence that hung in the air, a stark contrast to the cheerful banter that typically accompanied Sarah's visits. Furrowing his brow, Michael made his way toward Helen's bedroom, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpeting. As he neared the door, he heard a soft whimper, and his heart skipped a beat. Pushing the door open gently, Michael found his mother huddled in the corner, her frail frame trembling. Rushing to her side, he crouched down and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Mom, what happened?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Helen's eyes, rimmed with tears, darted nervously around the room. "She was here, Michael," she whispered, her voice shaking. She was rough with me again." Michael felt a surge of protective anger coursing through his veins. Carefully, he helped his mother to her feet and guided her to the living room, settling her into the familiar comfort of her favorite armchair. "What did she do, Mom?" he asked, his gaze searching her face for any signs of injury. Helen's hands trembled as she pulled back the sleeve of her blouse, revealing a series of angry-looking bruises on her delicate skin. "She grabbed my arm so tightly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and she said such horrible things to me." Michael clenched his jaw, his heart racing with a cocktail of emotions, anger, disbelief, and a deep sense of betrayal. "What did she say to you, Mom?" he asked, his voice low and even. Helen's eyes filled with shame as she recounted the nurse's cruel words, how she had called Helen a burden, a waste of time, and insisted that no one cared about her. Michael felt his blood boil, his fists clenching at his sides. How dare this woman, entrusted with his mother's care, treat her in such a callous and abusive manner? Gathering his composure, Michael placed a gentle hand on Helen's arm, his expression softening. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have listened to you. I should have seen the signs." Helen reached out and squeezed his hand, her eyes brimming with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "I was so afraid, Michael," she admitted. "I didn't want to believe it, but I knew something wasn't right." Michael nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Well, you don't have to be afraid anymore, Mom," he said, his tone resolute. "I'm going to put a stop to this right now." Leaving his mother in the safety of her armchair, Michael strode into the kitchen, where he found Sarah tidying up after their interrupted visit. The nurse looked up, her expression unreadable. "Sarah, we need to talk," Michael said, his voice low and serious. The nurse's brow furrowed, and she took a step back, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Is everything all right, Michael?" she asked, her tone feigning concern. Michael's eyes narrowed, and he felt the weight of his mother's trust pressing down on him. "No, everything is not all right," he said, his voice steady but laced with barely contained fury. "My mother has told me some very disturbing things about your behavior towards her, and the bruises on her arm seem to corroborate her claims." Sarah's expression shifted, and for a brief moment, Michael caught a glimpse of something dark and calculating in her eyes. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "Helen is a dear, but she can be a bit confused at times." Michael shook his head, his resolve unwavering. "I'm afraid I can no longer trust you to care for my mother," he said, his voice hard and unyielding. "I'm going to have to let you go, effective immediately." As the weight of his words settled in the air, Michael knew that this was just the beginning. He would need to do everything in his power to protect his mother and ensure that justice was served, no matter the cost. The tension in the kitchen was palpable as Michael confronted Sarah, the home health aide he had entrusted with his mother's care. The nurse's expression shifted from feigned concern to something darker, more calculating, as she realized the gravity of the situation. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Sarah said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "Helen is a dear, but she can be a bit confused at times." Michael shook his head, his resolve unwavering. "I'm afraid I can no longer trust you to care for my mother," he said, his voice hard and unyielding. "I'm going to have to let you go, effective immediately." Sarah's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Michael saw a flash of anger in her expression before she quickly schooled her features into a mask of concern. "Please, Michael, let's not be too hasty," she said, taking a step closer to him. "I care deeply about your mother, and I would never do anything to hurt her." Michael held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "The bruises on her arm tell a different story, Sarah," he said, his voice low and steady. "And her fear of being left alone with you is all the evidence I need." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Michael raised his hand, silencing her. "I want you to leave now," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "And don't come back." The nurse's gaze darted around the kitchen, as if she were searching for a way to salvage the situation, but in the end, she seemed to realize that Michael's mind was made up. With a huff, Sarah gathered her belongings and headed for the door, pausing only to cast a resentful glance in Michael's direction. "You'll regret this, you know," she muttered, her voice laced with venom. "Your mother is lucky to have someone like me looking after her." Michael simply watched her go, his jaw set with determination. As the door slammed shut behind Sarah, he let out a long, shaky breath, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. Returning to the living room, Michael found his mother curled up in her chair, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and trepidation. "She's gone, Mom," he said, kneeling beside her and taking her hands in his own. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Helen's lips trembled as she searched her son's face, a glimmer of hope sparking in her eyes. "You believe me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael nodded, giving her hands a gentle squeeze. "Of course I believe you, Mom," he said, his voice laced with regret. "I should have listened to you from the start. I'm so sorry I didn't. Helen reached out and cupped his cheek, her expression softening. It's not your fault, Michael, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I knew it would be hard for you to believe, but I'm just grateful you eventually saw the truth. Michael pulled his mother into a warm embrace, his heart aching at the thought of her having to endure such fear and abuse. I promise, I'll never let anyone hurt you like that again, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. As they held each other, Michael's mind raced with the implications of what had just occurred. He knew that he couldn't simply let this matter rest, not when his mother's well-being and safety had been so egregiously compromised. Pulling back, he studied Helen's face, his expression resolute. Mom, I need to report this to the authorities, he said, his voice firm but gentle. What Sarah did to you was unacceptable, and she needs to be held accountable. Helen's eyes widened, and for a moment, Michael saw a flicker of fear pass across her features. But what if they don't believe me? She asked, her voice trembling. Michael reached out and squeezed her hand reassuringly. They'll believe you, Mom, he said, his tone unwavering. I'll make sure of it, and I'll be right by your side every step of the way. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the living room in a warm golden glow, Michael knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult battle. But for the sake of his mother's safety and well-being, he was more than willing to fight. As the sun set on the quiet suburban neighborhood, Michael sat beside his mother in the living room, his mind racing with the weight of the decision he had made. After confronting Sarah and dismissing her from their home, he knew that he could no longer ignore the troubling allegations his mother had made. Helen's fear and the evidence of physical abuse were simply too compelling to dismiss. But even as Michael's resolve to take action had solidified, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt and hesitation. After all, Sarah had been a trusted professional, and the thought of accusing her of such heinous acts was a bitter pill to swallow. Michael glanced at his mother, who sat beside him, her frail frame still trembling from the encounter. The sight of the bruises on her delicate skin made his stomach churn with a mixture of anger and protectiveness. Mom, he began, his voice soft and soothing, I know this has been a terrible ordeal for you, but I need to know, are you absolutely certain about what Sarah did? Helen's eyes, once filled with a vibrant spark, now held a haunted, weary look. She nodded slowly, her hands clasping and unclasping in her lap. Yes, Michael, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know what I saw, what I felt. She was cruel, and she hurt me. Michael reached out and covered her hands with his own, giving them a gentle squeeze. I believe you, Mom, he said, his voice steady and resolute. But I also know how difficult this must be for you. I can't imagine how betrayed you must feel. Helen's gaze met his, and in that moment, Michael saw the depth of her anguish. She had trusted Sarah, had welcomed the home health aide into their lives in the hopes of making things easier. And now, that trust had been shattered, leaving her feeling vulnerable and exposed. I'm just so tired, Michael, Helen said, her voice cracking with emotion. I don't want to have to fight anymore. Can't we just let it go? Michael's heart sank at the defeated tone in his mother's voice. He knew that taking action against Sarah would only add to the upheaval and stress that Helen had already endured. But the thought of allowing the nurse's abusive behavior to go unchecked was simply unacceptable. I wish we could, Mom, he said, his voice laced with regret. But I can't just ignore what she did to you. It's not right, and I won't let her get away with it. Helen's eyes filled with tears, and Michael felt a pang of guilt at causing her more anguish. But he knew, deep down, that he had to do the right thing, not just for his mother, but for himself, and for the countless other elderly individuals who might fall victim to predatory caregivers like Sarah. I'm going to report this to the authorities, Mom, he said, his voice firm but gentle. They need to investigate what happened, and Sarah needs to be held accountable. Helen's expression shifted, a glimmer of fear and uncertainty flickering in her eyes. But what if they don't believe me, she asked, her voice trembling. What if they think I'm just an old, confused woman? Michael reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I won't let that happen, Mom, he said, his tone resolute. I'll be with you every step of the way, and I'll make sure your voice is heard. We'll get through this together, I promise. As the room fell silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel, Michael knew that the path ahead would not be an easy one. but for the sake of his mother's safety and well-being, he was more than willing to fight whatever battles lay in store. With a deep breath, he rose from his seat, his expression filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "I'm going to call the police, Mom," he said, his voice calm and determined. "It's time to put an end to this." As he stepped away, Helen reached out and grasped his hand, her eyes pleading. "Please, Michael," she whispered, "be careful." Michael nodded, offering his mother a reassuring smile. "I will, Mom," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "I promise." The decision to report Sarah's alleged abuse weighed heavily on Michael as he dialed the number for the local police department. He knew that taking this step would inevitably add more upheaval and stress to his mother's already fragile state, but he also couldn't ignore the growing sense of responsibility he felt to protect her. As the call connected, Michael took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. "Yes, I'd like to report a case of suspected elder abuse," he said, his voice resolute. "My mother has been the victim of physical and verbal abuse by her home health aide." The dispatcher listened intently as Michael recounted the troubling details, his mother's fearful expression and the bruises on her arm serving as the most damning evidence. "I see," the dispatcher responded, her tone serious. "We'll dispatch an officer to your residence immediately to investigate. Can you please provide your address?" Michael rattled off the address, his heart pounding in his chest. As he ended the call, he turned to face his mother, who had been watching him with a mixture of trepidation and hope. "They're sending someone over right away, Mom," he said, reaching out to take her hand. "Everything's going to be all right." Helen's eyes searched his face, her expression conflicted. "Are you sure about this, Michael?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they don't believe me?" Michael gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his expression resolute. "I believe you, Mom," he said, his voice firm. "And the bruises on your arm will back up your story. The police have to take this seriously." Helen nodded, but the worry in her eyes remained. Michael could only imagine how difficult this must be for her, to have her trust betrayed in such a profound way, and now to be forced to confront the very person who had hurt her. "I know this is hard, Mom," he said, his voice laced with empathy, "but I promise I'll be right here with you. We're going to get through this together." Helen's grip on his hand tightened, and Michael could see the glimmer of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The sound of a knock at the door interrupted their moment, and Michael felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. Squeezing his mother's hand one last time, he rose from his seat and made his way to the front door, taking a deep breath before pulling it open. Two uniformed police officers stood on the threshold, their expressions sullen. "Good evening, sir," the taller of the two officers said, his voice calm and professional. "We received a report of suspected elder abuse. Is this the residence?" Michael nodded, stepping aside to allow the officer's entry. "Yes, that's right," he said, his voice steady. "My mother is the victim, and the perpetrator was her home health aide, Sarah." The officers exchanged a glance, and Michael could see the wheels turning in their minds as they processed the information. "If you don't mind, we'd like to speak with your mother and get a statement from her," the shorter officer said, her voice gentle. Michael nodded, leading the way to the living room, where Helen sat, her hands trembling in her lap. "Mom, the police are here to talk to you," he said, his voice soothing. "They just want to hear your side of the story." Helen's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and resignation, but she nodded, her gaze meeting the officers with a quiet determination. As the officers began their questioning, Michael watched on, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and trepidation. He knew that this was only the beginning of a long and difficult process, but for the first time since this ordeal had begun, he felt a glimmer of hope that justice might finally be served. The aftermath of Helen's report to the police was a whirlwind of activity and uncertainty. In the days that followed, detectives from the local precinct conducted a thorough investigation, interviewing both Helen and Michael in detail about the allegations against Sarah, the home health aide. Michael had been apprehensive about the process, worried that his mother's word might not carry enough weight against the claims of a professional caregiver. But to his relief, the officers took the matter seriously, examining the bruises on Helen's arm and listening intently to her account of the abuse. "We take these kinds of allegations very seriously," the lead detective, a seasoned officer named Detective Ramirez, had assured them. Your mother's safety and well-being are our top priority." As the investigation progressed, Michael couldn't help but feel a growing sense of vindication. The evidence they had uncovered, including statements from other clients who had reported concerning behavior from Sarah, seemed to corroborate his mother's story. The nurse's employment records also revealed a troubling pattern of complaints and disciplinary actions, further undermining her credibility. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting and uncertainty, the police made their move. Sarah was arrested and charged with elder abuse, and Michael breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that his mother's tormentor would be held accountable for her actions. However, the weight of the ordeal had taken a toll on Helen's fragile psyche. The once vibrant woman had become increasingly withdrawn and anxious, her trust in the world around her shaken to the core. Michael spent countless hours at his mother's side, offering comfort and reassurance, but he could see the lingering effects of the trauma etched in her features. The once bright spark in her eyes had dimmed, and she'd often retreated into herself, lost in her own thoughts. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Michael would murmur, his heart aching at the sight of his mother's suffering. "I wish I could take all of this away." Helen would offer him a weak smile, her hand reaching out to grasp his. "It's not your fault, Michael," she would say, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've done so much for me." Despite the progress in the case against Sarah, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He knew that the legal process would be long and arduous, and he couldn't help but worry about the toll it would take on his already fragile mother. As the days turned into weeks, the family's routine gradually began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Helen's daily visits from the new home health aide, a kind-faced woman named Emily, had helped to ease her anxiety, and she seemed to take comfort in the familiarity of her own home. But Michael couldn't shake the lingering fear that the damage done by Sarah's betrayal might be too deep to heal. He had seen the way his mother's spirit had been crushed, and he knew that the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting a warm light on their surroundings, Michael turned to his mother and gently squeezed her hand. "Mom, I want you to know how proud I am of you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've been so brave, and I know this hasn't been easy, but I promise we're going to get through this together." Helen's eyes, rimmed with unshed tears, met his, and for a moment, Michael saw a glimmer of the strength and determination that had always defined her. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." As the embers of the fire crackled and danced, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would do whatever it took to ensure that his mother's safety and well-being were protected, and that justice was served for the abuses she had endured. With a deep breath, he knew that the journey ahead would be arduous, but with his mother by his side, he was more than ready to face whatever challenges lay in store. As the legal proceedings against Sarah, the former home health aide, unfolded, Michael found himself filled with a mix of emotions. On one hand, he was relieved that the woman who had so cruelly betrayed his mother's trust was being held accountable for her actions. But on the other, he couldn't help but worry about the toll the drawn-out process was taking on Helen's fragile psyche. The months that followed the initial report were a whirlwind of court appearances, depositions, and seemingly endless paperwork. Michael accompanied his mother to every hearing, his hand firmly clasped around hers, offering silent support as she recounted the harrowing details of the abuse she had endured. Despite the stress and upheaval, Helen's determination never wavered. She knew that speaking out was the only way to ensure that Sarah would not be able to harm anyone else, and she was resolved to see the case through to the end. "I don't want another family to go through what we've been through, Michael," she would say, her voice laced with a quiet strength that belied her delicate frame. As the trial date drew nearer, Michael could see the toll the experience was taking on his mother. Helen's once vibrant spirit had dimmed, and she'd often retreated into herself, lost in a maze of worry and uncertainty. "What if they don't believe me, Michael?" she would ask, her eyes filled with a fear that her son had rarely seen. "What if Sarah gets away with what she's done?" Michael would pull his mother into a comforting embrace, his heart aching at the thought of her having to relive the trauma once more. "I won't let that happen, Mom," you would assure her, his voice firm and unwavering. "The evidence is on our side, and I'll be right there with you every step of the way." When the day of the trial finally arrived, the courtroom was filled with a tense, palpable energy. Helen sat beside Michael, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as the prosecution laid out their case against Sarah. The testimony was harrowing, and Michael watched as his mother's resolve was tested time and time again. But throughout it all, Helen remained steadfast, her voice unwavering as she recounted the horrific details of the abuse she had endured. As the trial progressed, the evidence against Sarah mounted, and it became increasingly clear that the nurse's previous claims of innocence were nothing more than a desperate attempt to evade the consequences of her actions. When the final verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and applause. Sarah was found guilty on all counts, and the judge handed down a sentence that ensured she would spend a significant amount of time behind bars. As they left the courthouse, Michael wrapped his arm around his mother's trembling shoulders, offering her a gentle squeeze. "It's over, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it." Helen's eyes glistened with tears, but there was a newfound lightness to her expression that Michael hadn't seen in months. "I couldn't have done it without you, Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for believing in me, and for never giving up." In the days and weeks that followed, Michael witnessed a remarkable transformation in his mother. With the weight of the trial lifted from her shoulders, Helen's spirit slowly began to rekindle, the spark in her eyes reigniting with each passing day. She embraced the newfound freedom and safety of her home, no longer fearing the arrival of a caregiver she could not trust. And with the steadfast support of her son, Helen began to heal, slowly but surely, from the wounds of her ordeal. As the seasons changed and the years passed, Michael marveled at the resilience of his mother's spirit. She had weathered a storm that would have broken many, and emerged stronger for it, her love for life and for her family shining brighter than ever before. And in that, Michael found his own strength and resolve to continue fighting for the safety and well-being of the elderly, determined to ensure that no one else would have to endure the kind of trauma and betrayal that his mother had suffered. The road ahead was long, but with Helen by his side, Michael knew that he was more than ready to face whatever challenges lay in store.